Hey there, leaders at Western Colorado University. This is Craig in Career Services coming to you from Library 120. Uh, Listen, we're not going to have a lot of probably in-person meetings this year, but don't worry, all of our resources are available virtually by email, online, and so you'll be able to connect with us anytime. And so today, I wanted to give you a really brief overview of what we do in Career Services, and then we'll get into a slideshow about building a resume. As a student leader here on campus, as an employee, as a future member of the workforce, building a resume is just simply one of the basic skills you're going to need to possess, and doesn't mean that you need to be an expert on resume theory by any means. But what I hope this presentation today is going to give you is things to think about as you're building your resume in terms of the perspective that you're trying to bring and who you're trying to reach and how you're communicating your value to employers. So real quick about career services. Resume edits are the biggest thing that I help students with on a day-to-day basis. I would say it's probably 3/4 or more of my meetings in any given month are to specifically help with resumes. But I'm here to support you on a lot of other things. Depending on your needs, writing a cover letter, which is, cover letters are generally going to be required of every job application. And there's something that a lot of people have never necessarily written before, especially when they're in college. So how to write a compelling cover letter. If you're not even to that point of creating resumes and cover letters, but you're just looking to explore what can you do with a major, or what major should you be pursuing based on what you see yourself doing after Western. And so career exploration and career planning, we can definitely talk about that. Internships, which I encourage every student to participate in as many as possible during your time at Western. Job searches for when you're preparing to graduate, of course, and mock interviews, again, just to help prepare for that process. But I mean, even just things like how to dress for an interview, how to network and get out there and meet folks from your intended career path. We can talk about all of these things and kind of tailor services to your needs. So get in touch anytime. You can self-schedule appointments through Handshake. As I kind of mentioned, appointments probably are going to be virtual this year, at least to start the fall semester. A lot of things we can do simply by email without even a live meeting if you prefer that. But clearly via Zoom or other methods, we can also meet in real time. So that's just a little bit about us. Now, what is a resume? First of all, a resume is brief. Okay, it summarizes your qualifications, your skills, kind of in a way you're fit for a particular position. Now, when I say brief, I typically mean for college students, 1 page. 2 pages, there's absolutely nothing wrong with 2 pages. And if you have the right experience, if you have enough experience and skills, education, things that you can fill a resume in a compelling way on 2 pages, then 2 pages is just fine. But as a general rule, keep in your mind that typically a college student up through graduation and through their first job search, a college student typically can get away with 1 page, and that's going to be pretty effective because it's a quick way to summarize your experience. But as your career grows, your resume is going to expand. It's going to get longer. And it depends on sort of the advice that you look for online, but typically somewhere between every 7 to 10 years of professional experience, you're probably going to add a page to your resume, just out of necessity, because you're going to be adding new positions. There's just more content to include, so your resume is naturally going to get longer. But also keep in mind that a resume is a marketing tool. This is your first way to market yourself to an employer. And this sort of gets to the point of of customizing, of editing and updating your resume, which is that you are marketing yourself. That's true, but you're marketing yourself to employers and for positions that have different needs. Different companies, different organizations just have different needs. They're looking for people with perhaps different skill sets, with different kinds of experience. And so, though I call it a personal marketing tool, that is not to say that you should just create one resume and then that's your resume for the year or for the rest of your life. That you still need to be communicating your talents in the language of the employer that you are applying to. And so, even though it's a personal marketing tool, you need to be considering the needs of employers as you build your resume. Now, your resume's purpose, let's just be really clear here, is not to get you a job. That isn't what resumes do. Even in a perfect world, employers, you might have the perfect resume, but they're going to want to meet you. They're going to want to know that you are capable of shaking a hand and looking somebody in the eye and having a meaningful conversation, whether that's about work or just about personal lives, things like this. And so a resume isn't going to land you a job. What you hope your resume does is that it gets you an interview or at least a follow-up call of some sort. You want your resume to be compelling enough to an employer that they are going to invest a little bit of time on you and to invite you into a process to learn more about you. That's all you're doing, which this goes back to the customization piece of a resume, is that if you're not speaking to an employer in terms that they understand and in terms that are meaningful to them as an organization, then they're going to have a hard time seeing your value to the company. So keep a focus on just the idea that you're just trying to get yourself an interview. The interview is where you're then going to go and really shine, show off your personality. This is just a list to say that a resume, although it's something that you're going to spend time on probably for the rest of your career, a resume is only one tiny piece of an application process potentially. Now, for a lot of positions you're going to apply to, they may only want a resume and a cover letter. But depending on the types of positions or schools that you're applying to, obviously, references are going to be critical probably in every application. Writing sample, not as common, but now is the time to be thinking about that, particularly if you plan to go into an area like law, if you're planning to go to graduate school, or obviously writing jobs of many types, editing, copywriter, these kind of things, then a writing sample is going to be really critical. That's something that you can be thinking about now and updating now so that you have a writing sample ready to go when the time comes. Transcripts, you may be required to submit either an official or unofficial transcript from the university. A portfolio, especially in the creative arts, portfolios are popular ways to just show a body of work. But more and more, many places are requesting portfolios even in non-arts positions. And so having a portfolio at least ready to go, thinking about the pieces, whether that's writing or creative work or whatever it is, but thinking about the pieces that you would want to include in a portfolio would be a good thing for you to be thinking about now so that it's ready to go. Proof of certifications, you may mention certifications. This could be anything, CPR, this could be highly specific technological certifications, but you may be required to provide evidence of those. It's one thing to list a certification on your resume. It's another thing to have the card or the certificate from an organization or from a company, from an accreditation body that demonstrates that you actually have those. So if you're going to claim certifications on your resume, you should be keeping those certifications handy somewhere. Even if they're just virtual, keep them in a folder in your email account or save them to your personal computer. Background check is another one. Many positions, of course, especially things like government positions, law enforcement, but also lots of other private organizations do require a background check and or drug test as part of an application process. So keep that in mind for your entire career. Just remember that your actions outside of the job search or outside of the office building where you work can affect current and future employment. Now, I'm going to talk about a lot of things today, but just remember here that the first rule of resumes is that there really aren't any rules. That at the end of the day, this is a personal document that you get to build and that you have to be comfortable with. And so I'm going to give you a lot of advice here, a lot of recommendations, just based on what we tend to see working for application processes, especially with private and government organizations. But mostly you should view all of these as guidelines. At the end of the day, you're the one that has to send your resume out. You're the one that has to be prepared to talk about your resume in a meaningful way, and you need to be proud of your resume. So don't take these as rules, as anything that you have to change necessarily. Think of them as opportunities to improve your resume, and that you can then build from there. So a resume is a reflection of you. It is a representation of you to a potential employer. But your resume is not you. This is not your life story. Okay, you are not required to incorporate every job you've ever held. You're not required to incorporate every skill that you believe you have. Remember, again, this goes back to this idea of customizing a resume, of tailoring a resume to an employer, that you want to reflect the parts of you that an employer is going to value and is going to want to bring into their organization. Okay, so this is part of the reason that we're not going for a long resume. We're not going for an overly detailed resume. We're just going for a resume that communicates the important stuff that an employer needs to know. A resume is also just one part of your personal brand. Whether any of us like it or not nowadays, we all have a personal brand of some sort. And that brand is largely played out through social media and through online engagement, right? So how consistent is your voice across the internet, across your social interactions online, because those are the things that people are going to be able to find, right? I mean, generally speaking, an employer is going to be able to look up your LinkedIn or your Facebook or your Instagram account pretty easily, but also even things like comments in comment sections on various websites sometimes can be found depending on how you manage your online presence. So keep in mind that the resume is one piece of your personal brand, but your resume and the vibe you're giving off with your resume is going to have to be consistent with the rest of your presence online. So this is an opportunity right now to, if you need to clean up, to tighten up your online presence in general, because employers will look for you online. A resume, as we hinted, only is getting your foot in the door. A resume isn't getting you a job. It's just getting you the interview. So this goes back again to the piece that you do need to have some understanding of how to build a quality resume, but also understand that there are other pieces that you're going to want to work on. You're going to want to prepare for your interview, whether that's a virtual interview, a phone interview, or an in-person interview. You're going to want to prepare for that. You're going to want to prepare for how you dress, right? There are a lot of pieces that go into an application process. And as important as the resume is, it's not the only piece. So don't expect that you're just going to get some feedback on your resume and that resume is going to land you a bunch of jobs. There are different standards for various employers, companies, for stages in your career, for fields of work. Government jobs, typically, at least in the U.S., tend to require a slightly different type of a resume than say, going to work for a private company. So keep in mind, the advice that I'm going to provide today, for the most part, is general advice for any kind of a resume. But do check in with faculty, with people in your professional network in the field that you want to work in. Get feedback from other folks as well on specific things that you may want to be including in your resume. For example, there are certainly fields like computer science and lots of the sciences, STEM careers, where skills and certifications are really critical to demonstrating your value to a company. But there are other positions where they may only be looking for sort of general skills like good communication skills, people skills. What they're really looking for is your experience to see that you've done this kind of work before and had some success. So just be aware of that, different standards. And I tend to harp throughout this presentation on the idea that things like formatting, grammar, and your content, they all matter basically equally. You can have perfect content, great edited, perfectly worded content, but if your formatting is so terrible and so misshapen that people just don't want to read your resume, then that's going to be a problem for your employment chances. So formatting is just as important as the quality of writing that you put into your document. So for now, what I encourage you to be thinking about is one good page. You certainly are. Let me move this around so we can all see the memes. One page for now. Again, I mentioned if you're on 2 pages and it's a good 2 pages, that's not a problem. But if you are not so sure about how much you love your resume, or maybe you're just starting to kind of build your resume for the first time, focus on just one good page. Don't overwhelm yourself with having to have a long document. Margins 1 inch is standard. You can shrink that a little bit or even potentially grow that a little bit as needed to help with formatting pieces. But for the most part, 1 inch is it's standard, it's expected. It looks good on paper if the document is printed. So try to stick with 1 inch if you can, and kind of fudge with that only as needed. No wizards or templates. If you've built a first resume using like a Microsoft Wizard template, or you downloaded something from the internet, consider taking your document out of that template. And the reason is that you can, for the most part, you can rebuild templates pretty easily in Microsoft Word on your own. You don't need a template to do it. You can do it with fairly basic editing tools in Word. It may take you a little bit longer on the front end to set everything up, so that you know how to do it all. But in the long run, it's going to save you a bunch of time as you find yourself editing your resume every year or two, because templates can be really difficult when it comes to editing. You add a few words and that pops something over, and for some reason, not all the words are appearing because it's too big for the template space. So try not to use a template. If you want some support in terms of how to set up at least basic formatting features in Word, get in touch. We can talk about how to do that on your own. Basic fonts. We'll talk about fonts again just in a second here, but use a common non-decorative font. We don't want fancy fonts at all. We want fonts that are easy to read, that are easy on the eyes, and also fonts that are common on computers around the world, potentially, certainly around the country. And so fonts like Calibri, Times New Roman, Arial, right? These are fonts that are basically loaded on every computer, and so they're going to be easy for somebody else's computer to interpret and to read. Now, I mentioned quality paper here. It's very possible that you all may never print a resume in your life. You may only apply with virtual resumes, but it's always good to have a few paper resumes handy, especially when you're going to a career fair, a job fair, when you're meeting with an interview team in person. Even though they have your materials digitally, it's helpful to bring along paper copies to share with them in person, so that they have something to take home with them. And when I say quality paper, nowadays you really don't actually have to get that fancy with the paper of your resume. Just a decent basic printer paper stock, white paper, easy enough. Keep it simple, but make sure that the paper is crisp, that it's not creased, that you take care of it once you print them. Avoid excessive formatting, italics, underlining, bold, all caps. All of these things are good to use for formatting purposes in a resume, but if you do too much of any of them, it just takes away from the value of that formatting, and actually makes your document harder to use. No photos, no clip art. Don't add any unnecessary decoration unless you are a graphic designer and this is part of your gig, is that you design things. Otherwise, just keep it simple to just a straight text document with very basic formatting. And then keywords, searchability. We're going to talk about this, but nowadays, since you're applying probably online for most positions, you're going to want to make sure that your document is searchable by either people on their computer, or by algorithms that are reading your documents and grading your documents on behalf of those companies. Oops, let's go back. So paper versus electronic. Again, you all likely will be doing electronic applications for the most part through your career. So just be aware that you'll be applying oftentimes through what are called ATS, applicant tracking systems. And these systems are set up very purposefully to read resumes and to grade, essentially, to grade resumes based just on the text that they can read. And so there is a difference with electronic resumes versus paper resumes in the sense that you have to make sure that you're using keywords, that you're using proper grammar, and simple but appropriate formatting, so that these automated systems, these computer algorithms, can actually grab the text, the content of your materials, and that's going to include your name, your contact information, and all of this. For that reason, formatting can be problematic. Don't go nuts with formatting. Again, we want to keep formatting pretty simple, just so it doesn't create problems, either just aesthetically or problems for these ATS. Keywords we've talked about, you want it to be searchable because a company is going to be looking for a specific set of skills that they probably list in their job posting. And if you're not highlighting those skills on your own part, that can set you out of competition. Headers and footers, just go to the formatting piece. And my recommendation typically is don't use the header or the footer. Just put all of your text right in the main body of the document, just because it's possible sometimes that some of these systems aren't checking headers and footers, right? They're looking for the main content that you're uploading. So try to avoid putting your name and contact information or other things in headers and footers. Bullets versus paragraphs. Bullets, when we describe positions, bullets typically are going to be recommended versus paragraphs. They're shorter, they're easier to read. It's more likely that an employer is going to take time to look at a couple of short bullets than to read kind of a paragraph of more narrative text. And then we talk about plain text, Word, PDF. At the end of the day, PDF generally is going to be the preferred way to save your documents. It would be to prepare your document, to create your document in Microsoft Word, and then from there, export it as a PDF. And the reason is that when you export a Word document to PDF, it's going to recognize all of the words because it's turning all those words from a Word document into a PDF. That's going to make your PDF searchable really easily when you upload it. On the other hand, for example, if you were to scan a document and save it as a PDF, well, Adobe and other programs don't necessarily, or at least not very well, they don't read words that are scanned in. But when they're typed into a Word document, then those are passed over in the programming language, and it's easy to find those words and just do a word search or a keyword search in a PDF. And then serif and sans serif fonts. We're going to talk about that next here. Now, this isn't maybe the biggest decision that you're going to have to make, but do be aware that there's a difference here. Now, serif, as you can see on the left, serif fonts have these little tick marks, right, at the top and bottom of a bunch of these letters, right? And they kind of tend to come to these sort of sharp points, okay? And you can see it on all these fonts. They all have these little lines or these little flags at the tops and the bottoms of letters. Sans serif, sans meaning just simply without, no serif. These are like these fonts over here, right? Arial, Calibri are two of the popular ones. And the letters are, you can see there are none of those little marks at the end of these letters. Now, what's the difference? Well, serif fonts on the left here, serif fonts are built for readability. And the important part of readability is that keep in mind that when these fonts were invented a long time ago, that books were still only, there were no computers. So books were all printed on paper. In the early days of printing was also really expensive. And so what these serifs allowed is they allowed publishers to print text really small, but still keep it pretty readable because these ticks highlight sort of the edges of letters. And even you can see like the O is definitely thicker on the sides and thinner on the top and bottom. And so this is all about readability, but particularly readability on printed paper, okay? Sans serif came along because, of course, at some point computers came along, when you're reading on a computer screen, these sans serif fonts are actually kind of preferred because they're cleaner. And keep in mind that a computer screen is pixelated, right? It's just a big series of thousands of tiny little pixels. Well, when you start getting really small with these serifs in pixels, the serifs don't necessarily always come through quite as sharply. But on a printed paper with ink or toner, these are going to come through really sharply. On a computer screen, these fonts tend to be cleaner and just easier to read. At the end of the day, does it matter which of these you use? Maybe not. It's sort of a personal choice. I would say that these serif fonts tend to feel a little more traditional, a little more, I guess I would say old-fashioned, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but a little just more formal. The sans serif fonts feel a little bit cleaner and a little bit more modern, and so there may just be a vibe that you're going for, depending on the job that you're applying to or just your personality. So do keep that in mind when it comes to font selection in your resume. So we're going to run through basically 4 sections here. The almost always section, because these are things that you're pretty much always going to include in a resume. Do, however, keep in mind that there are a bunch of other things that you can include in your resume listed over here in this right column. And these are good things to include if you have them to include, but aren't, strictly speaking, necessary at all. So your heading section, first of all, obviously your name, however you want your name to be presented to employers. That could be, in this case, this person went with Jerome, this hypothetical person went with Jerome, but, maybe Jerome really goes by Jerry, and maybe that's what he's known as in professional circles as well as personal circles. He could include Jerry instead of Jerome. We have a physical address, a phone number, and an email address. Now, what we have down here is just a different way to highlight them. In this case down here, Jerome omitted his physical address, but included a website. And this is totally legitimate. Nowadays, it's less and less common to include a physical address or a mailing address on a resume, both for privacy reasons, but also just because an employer probably isn't going to be mailing you anything, at least at this point. Now, maybe after you're hired, they might mail you a welcome gift or something, but at this point in the process, they're not going to be mailing you anything. So you can save a little space. If you have a website, a portfolio, or a personal blog that you want employers to be knowing about, it's totally appropriate to be including that up here also. And I make a note over here about hyperlinks. So this is a mixed bag, and again, kind of something that you just have to make a judgment call on. If you may know this, but if you type an email address like this, jstudent@western.edu, into Word, and you hit space or enter, it's automatically going to turn this into a hyperlink, and it's going to be blue text with an underline. Well, that just is going to look ugly and inconsistent if that's the only blue thing on your resume. And so I'm going to encourage you to do something with the hyperlink. Your options are either simply right click and remove the hyperlink. Okay. Now that's going to format this back to regular text, just like it looks here in this example. So you won't have that blue. On the other hand, you also can simply reformat this text. When it turns it to a hyperlink, besides making a clickable link, all it's doing to the text is it's just it's coloring it blue and it's underlining it. And so you can actually just highlight this text, simply go unclick, underline, and then click your text color back to black. And now you're going to have a font that looks like everything else. But if the employer is looking over this document digitally and hovers over this with their mouse, it's still going to be clickable. So I encourage you to do something with those hyperlinks just for aesthetic reasons. Education. So, of course, we're going to list the institution that we attended. Its location is a critical piece of education and work history. So we're generally going to include the location, the city, and the state. For education, what's the degree you earn? Now keep in mind here that the degree you're earning is different than your major, right? Western offers a bunch of Bachelor of Arts degrees across multiple different majors. So don't assume that the employer knows that you have a Bachelor of Arts. Okay, you want to spell this out, and it could just be BA. It could be abbreviated down here because this is a pretty common abbreviation. We want to put our graduation date, or if your graduation date's in the future, we can include anticipated or expected. Your major will be an important piece for a lot of job applications, so you may want to include major and potentially minor. And GPA, GPA is highlighted over here, this asterisk, for a reason, along with minors and honors awards, because GPA isn't actually required. If a company needs verification of your GPA, they're typically going to ask for a transcript, and so they can verify that for real. They don't necessarily trust it just because it's on your resume. So GPA, totally optional. If it's something you want to include for now, that's just fine. Just be aware after you've attained your first full-time job and gotten into your field a little bit, for the most part, employers don't care about your GPA. So I would feel very comfortable just leaving GPA off of your resume altogether and providing a transcript as requested. So education tips only list schools that you actually earned a credential from. Okay, let me move this so we can see exhibit over here. So if you attended the University of Tennessee and you transferred to Western in your sophomore year, you don't need to list the University of Tennessee. You don't need to sort of put out there that you transferred. That's not really relevant to an employer for the most part. But if you earn your degree from Western, you're just going to list Western as your university, along with the year that you graduated. Do try to be as specific as necessary. If you have honors that you want to talk about, if your minor is relevant to a job application, certainly include as much of that information as you feel like you need to include. But again, make sure that it's relevant information or that the employer is going to care about it. And we kind of talked about my opinion on the GPA question. And then work experience. So kind of similar to education, of course, we want to list the employer that you worked for. We want to list your well, this one's backwards, the title, your job title, which I'm kind of circling with my mouse up here, who you worked for, their location again. Now, work experience is a little different. Education, you only want to list your graduation term or your graduation date. With employment, we want to list a range of dates. And typically that's, especially coming out of college, that's typically going to be month and year. And so you'll list that range. And this is so an employer can establish a work history. And then, of course, we've got our bullet points down here to talk about what you did in that position. You can see over here on the left, basically the 5 critical pieces of information that you're going to include about employers. And let me move this guy again. And there are options. If you have some relevant work experience that you want to highlight, then we can actually break this up into other sections, like a relevant experience section and an additional work section. And this is mostly just so you can put your relevant stuff on top or up first, so the employer definitely sees that. And then you can kind of bury additional work history that's maybe less relevant somewhere else in the document. So chronological is the common way to list your work experience. This just means you're listing your current or your most recent position up top or first, and then working backwards from there. Bullets and paragraphs, we talked about this a little bit. Bullets generally are going to be preferred in these kind of cases. Strictly speaking, there's nothing wrong with paragraphs. It's just a little less likely that an employer is going to actually read paragraphs of text as opposed to just a couple of bullets for each point. And I do, with these last 2 bullets, do want you to think about these things. So typically what we're taught, I think, with resumes is to list kind of what you did in a job. What was your job description on a day-to-day basis? What were the things you did? You swept the floor, you worked the cash register, those kind of things. But what I'm going to encourage you to talk about is instead what you accomplished. Or what you learned, skills that you developed. Try to be more specific, try to be more tailored. The bottom line is that if you waited tables at a restaurant, well, people generally know what it means to be a server, right? Or what it means to be on the wait staff of a restaurant, or to be a bartender, or to work at a McDonald's, like I did in my first job. You don't need to go into great detail describing what you did on a day-to-day basis. It's just not terribly interesting, and oftentimes not all that relevant for employers. If you can instead talk about what you accomplished, right? You increased sales, right, or exceeded sales expectations. You earned certain certifications. You were employee of the month, right? These are all things that you accomplished, and these can be a little bit more descriptive about your overall performance in a role than just listing things that you did. And then finally, we're going to talk about this here, but try to quantify your success. Try to put a number on it as much as possible, so that we're not just providing kind of vague descriptions like effectively communicated with customers. Well, that may be true, but what does that mean to an employer that's never met you, and that's never been to your workplace, and that's never met your customers? It doesn't necessarily describe a lot. But if you can say that you exceeded sales goals, for example, which is actually the example we're about to talk about, in your position, then that brings into it all kinds of things. First of all, simply that you are doing good at selling your product that you're supposed to do. But also, this kind of implies that you must be an okay communicator. You must have a personality that makes people want to buy from you. Okay, so try to provide more specifics, and I think what you'll find is that you'll actually get more bang for your buck out of your resume if you provide a couple of specific successes or achievements, as opposed to listing a bunch of general ones. And then leadership or activities, of course, in college, hopefully you're getting involved in things. This can be all kinds of stuff: volunteer positions, leadership roles in clubs or organizations, making the dean's list, the honors program. All kinds of things can happen in here. These are basically formatted similarly to other sections, except that we're often not going to include a bunch of description, right? We're just going to say, hey, we were a volunteer at 6 points in Gunnison from these dates. It can be as simple as that to list some of these activities here. And do be selective about your activities. The example I typically use is the idea of volunteering as opposed to real community engagement. And the reason is that that a lot of times you're a part of a club or a class, and your advisor or your faculty member says, hey, listen, you're required to go volunteer at community cleanup, for example. And you show up for the morning and you eat your pancake breakfast and you pick up a trash for a couple hours and you go home, and then you don't really think about it again, because you were really only attending because somebody kind of told you that you had to, or you got extra credit or something. Community engagement, on the other hand, is when you find something in the community that you're passionate about, and you participate regularly. You take an active role, a proactive role in terms of being involved in some aspect of the community, whether it's through the Gunnison Arts Center, through animal rescues here in town, whatever it might be. But if you can show lasting engagement with an organization or with a cause over time, that's much more powerful than just saying that one time you went and picked up trash at community cleanup. And employers do check these things, so do be careful about how you list these things and the language you use to describe these things, because employers will check up if it feels to them like you are maybe misleading them or trying to exaggerate your role in these things. That's not going to be good for you as a candidate. And then we have a bunch of these sometimes sections. Again, I said we're not really going to talk about these today, but just be aware that if you have these, some of these things, honors or awards, skills, certifications, languages, professional affiliations, certainly consider including those things. Some of these other ones, personal sections, don't recommend as a general rule. An objective statement, I don't recommend as a general rule. Summary is kind of a different thing that can be pretty helpful sometimes. And if you're interested, we can talk about what the difference is there. And then just simply be interesting. I mean, remember that these are employers that are hiring people that they're going to have to work with every day. They're going to have to supervise, and they want people who are going to be interesting to work with. I mean, it's one thing to be really skilled, But if nobody can bear to work with you and you don't talk to people and you're not a good teammate, then you're probably not going to last long in position. So you want to be interesting. You want to be appropriately open about yourself so that you can give them a little taste of who you are as a person outside of work, in addition to the skills that you're bringing to an office. And so you want to use your documents, your resume, your cover letter, certainly interview processes, not only to talk about your skills and experiences, but also your values, your interests. Of course, keeping in mind to do this in a way that is that's tactful and that's helpful to your chances of actually landing a position. Change your language up. Just if you use the same words over and over and over again throughout any document, whether it's a resume or a novel, it gets boring and people just don't want to read it. So change your language up and avoid cliches. The one that I tend to talk about is passionate. I'm passionate about customer service, or I'm passionate about sales. Well, again, this doesn't actually tell me a whole lot about who you are as a person. What does that mean, passionate? Does passionate mean that you're spending your nights reading magazine articles all the time? Does passionate mean that you spend 14 hours a day at work? Does passionate mean that if somebody challenges you on a decision they don't like, that you're going to blow up in their face? And well, nobody really knows, right? Passionate's a hard one to define. And so show people that you're passionate. Don't just say you're passionate. Show them you're passionate through the way that you talk about where you want to be going in your career, who you want to be as a professional, why you want to join their organization. And so this is just kind of a super quick summary of some of the things we've talked about. It used to be that resumes were formulaic. They were pretty robotic with a bunch of standard language, like that I'm a results-driven professional. They were pretty impersonal. And that's not necessarily the case these days. Now, typically, we still don't write resumes in the first person. We're still writing them in what is actually called the implied first person, but you're not going to use the word I probably ever on your resume. So you still need to make a resume exciting, right? So you still need to find your own voice in terms of telling your own story about your professional development. And then again, just reiterating here that employers increasingly are data driven. They have to be looking at the data and understanding growth potential or threats to the organization in order to make good decisions for the company. And so your resume should be too. You should be thinking about your successes and your experiences in terms of how you can quantify them for an employer. So this is just one example of quantitative descriptions. This is kind of a bad example. You might say as a bullet point on your job description that you sold automotive insurance plans. Well, that tells me your job description. It doesn't tell me that you were any good at it. It doesn't tell me how many you planned or you sold. So let's look at a slightly better version. You exceeded insurance sales expectations during most months of employment. Okay, so this is good. This is better because now it's giving us some relative perspective on your position, that the company you worked for had a sales expectation and that in most months you actually exceeded that sales expectation. And that's great. I mean, that's what employers typically are looking for. It's still missing a little bit of specificity. And so if instead we say we closed 18 insurance policy sales per month, exceeding sale targets for 14 consecutive months. Now it's giving this new employer a real perspective, not only on the fact that you exceeded expectations, but on how many. And this employer might look at your 18 policies a month and they might say, wow, we only require our people to sell 12 a month. This guy is exceeding expectations by 50%, right? Now you've really strengthened this bullet, even though it's a little bit longer, but it's a much stronger bullet point in this case. And then I think we're at the end here, basically. So just a note on application killers. Spelling and grammatical errors, they absolutely will kill your chances at getting many positions because employers are getting lots of job applications. And if you haven't taken the time to edit appropriately and to make sure that words are spelled correctly, then it's safe to assume that you're probably not going to do that when you're on the job either. Okay, so spelling and grammar are critical. Format and layout of your resume are critical in the sense that that nobody wants to read an ugly looking resume, right? If it's not organized, if it's not easy to scan with your eyes quickly and see where different sections are and make sense of the document, then people just won't read it. Including inappropriate personal information, just be very careful, especially when it comes to things like politics, religion, things like this. It's not that you shouldn't be proud of those experiences, but just know that it's a really diverse world. And even though employers, for the most part, are not allowed to discriminate based on some of those things, like maybe you're expecting a child, right? Maybe you are taking care of a sick parent, and an employer isn't allowed legally to discriminate against you on many of those factors. But the fact is that this happens all the time in employment situations. And so you have no obligation to put these things out there in the hiring process. You can speak with your employer later on about these things. Making promises you can't keep. Just be honest. That's the bottom line here. Be honest about your experience, about what you've actually accomplished in your career. Don't feed an employer a big line that you're making up just to try to get a job, because the only thing worse than not getting a job is getting a job and then 2 months later or 4 months later being let go because they realize that you're not actually capable of performing what you said you were. The wrong references, we don't talk about references here, but do be thoughtful about your references, who you choose as a reference, and be sure that they are going to be a strong positive reference for you. I would ask your references face to face if they can provide you a positive reference, and if they can't, then I would thank them for their honesty and go find somebody else. And then just failing to do your homework. Make sure that you're doing homework, that you're reading up, doing your research on the company, reading news headlines, looking at their website, checking out their strategic plan. You have to know about them and show an interest in the company if you expect them to, in turn, show interest in you. So finally, reach out anytime. I know this was a little bit of a long video, but if you'd like to talk about your specific resume or anything else related to career services, there again is my name, phone number, office number, email address, website. And again, you can self-schedule appointments in Handshake or just email me. So thanks so much. Good luck this year, everybody. Take care.